Before we get to today's stories, I would like to say a disclaimer. The stories presented in this video delve into themes that might be unsettling for some viewers, including graphic descriptions and eerie scenarios. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. These tales aren't for the faint of heart. If my chilling content sends shivers down your spine and leaves you craving more, please subscribe to my channel. Your support means the world to me. I lived in a haunted house. When my mother was pregnant with me, she and my father bought a house in very rural East Germany. My father was disabled, so he couldn't work anymore, and my mother worked in the psychiatric hospital an hour away. So my father was always left alone in the house, and he hated it. He told my mother he'd hear voices and footsteps, things would move, the TV would change channels, and so on. My mother always thought it was because of his medications. Heart defect, diabetes, and very strong pain medications, since her go-to was always, "No, you're just stressed and tired," since that was the same thing she told herself and continues to say to herself to this day. When I was born, my father was terrified to let me sleep on the attic, where my room was planned to be. He made me stay in his room until his excuses wouldn't work anymore. He always said that I'd have night terrors and so on, since my mother always did night shifts and therefore couldn't prove him wrong. He also put me in kindergarten at 9 months old because the house creeped him out too much. The first memories I have of this house are no different. I heard the voices of men's coughing and heavy footsteps, but I didn't have such a problem with it as my father did. I didn't think they were scary for some reason. At some point, my mother didn't have as many night shifts as she did back then, so I was moved to the room on the attic. It was way louder up there. I had the same experiences as my father. My TV would switch channels, my VHS player would act up, which wasn't that weird as I was used to that and thought they just did that, and the DVD player did the same. I had drapes in front of my bed that would move every night right next to the armchair that my mother put there. One plushie kept falling off of the shelf. And I had weird dreams, always of grown-arse men. A Russian soldier, 2 men that I could never put into a category. The men in my dreams would just be normal to me, not threatening, but just there. I was so young that I didn't know that this was a whole village for the Russian military in the GDR. And once the GDR was gone, the Russian soldiers left, and Germans would buy those houses. I called them by the names they told me, which were Sashka, Heinrich, and Max. Sasha and Max would always tell me never to go into the woods without my neighbors. I didn't question it. Why would I? I was 4, and my neighbors always watched me when my father was in the hospital and my mother was at work when the kindergarten was closed. The 3 would also always say never to talk to certain neighbors, which were basically all except those who watched me regularly. Once again, why would I question that? 4 years old, nice neighbors were fine, and those 3 were always nice. At one point, my mother got behind it that I experienced the same thing my father did. So she questioned my father and me separately. I described them, gave names, and told her how they talked and what they said. Yous brushed it off until we were both going to our beach, but I said I know a shortcut. We had a hidden beach that you can't even see on Google Maps to this day since it belongs to the military base next to our house. She didn't know, my dad didn't know, neighbors didn't know, no one really did. But I somehow led her to it through the forest, knew where I could, and couldn't step. What could possibly be in a forest, in an area that was full of war, next to a military base of the Russians? Exactly. Landmines. Never hit any, never saw any explode until I was 12. But we did find a lot of those that stepped on said mines. My mom asked me where I knew, and I told her, Sasha told me. Now at that point, she did get suspicious and did some research. Sasha was the first officer who lived there and had a heart attack. Max and Heinrich were normal people who moved there but died. Heinrich was very old, by the way. And for Max, my mother had to do more digging because she got the house from the bank. The guy that lived here before us hung himself. Max. I saw and heard them for years. Then it got less until it stopped when I moved into the room of my father when he died. But I always felt watched in that room. From the corner his bed was. Might just be paranoia, I'm 9 now and can think rationally now. There is nothing there, and those footsteps? Those aren't his footsteps he did when his feet tingled, no. It's the house settling. It's a wooden house, after all. Voices at 2 a.m.? Mind playing tricks. Things move, must be my ADHD. After all, I regularly forget my own age and search for the remote that's in my hands. Fast forward a few more years, I have a friend over, and we both decided to stay in the attic to watch Harry Potter, 'cause my old 80s TV had the DVD player. TV turns off. Must be the bad wiring. Light turns on. Maybe the switch wasn't fully flicked. TV turns on again, but now my VHS is running and New Pagadi is playing. That thing was spooky when I was a toddler, so nothing new. So I tried to fix it when my friend suddenly got quiet and called my name while staring at the direction of the door. There's a mirror on the chimney that I covered. I spray paint when I was a kid 'cause mirrors are creepy. What? I swear there's someone standing. You see things? No, I don't. That's a Russian. Very funny German. I literally thought she was kidding 'cause she always called me Russian as a nickname. I was the only Russian kid in our elementary school. So my head flicked to that. Look, he's staring right at us. Now I got creeped out, turned around and... see nothing. You see someone? Yeah. How do I know he's Russian? 'Cause of the uniform. You see him. Uniform? How the hell would she see my imaginary friends? At least I thought they were imaginary friends. Sasha, go away, as a joke. A bloody joke. And then she turned to me and straight up took her things and ran back down the stairs. She then told me that the Russian just nodded and left. She refused to go anywhere near my attic ever again and spent that night in a tent in the backyard. How the hell could she see my imaginary friend from when I was a toddler? At some point, my mother asked her about this, and after a long talk, she told her what she saw. So once my friend was back at her home the next day, my mother parked her car after we let her put and told me that those were not imaginary friends, that she thought they were, but got convinced otherwise when she once saw my father in the hallway just staring at her. Years after he died. She told me she yelled at him to go away, and he just left and went back into his room, which was where he died, and then became my room. I still don't know what the hell is up with that house, but let's just say that once I inherit it, it goes straight back to the bank. 'Cause if it really was ghosts, what do those guys in the attic really want? Why are they there? Why did they stare at my friend? Why could she see Sashka and I couldn't? But if he was bad, why did he just nod and leave her alone? Every time I go up to the attic, I feel watched. Every time I'm in my room, I feel watched. I still hear those footsteps and voices from the attic. Maybe those footsteps in my father's room were his stumping to get the blood flowing, but I do not want to know. I do not want to see him. I'd probably have the same reaction my mother had when she saw him. But I won't be keeping this house. Something has always gone wrong with this house anyway. It's expensive in the upkeep, and if ghosts are real, no thank you. When I thought I was being paranoid, but there might have actually been something to fear. Wanted to post this just to talk about it to someone, since it sometimes keeps me up at night. As for the relevant background information, my parents got divorced when I was around 10, and my mom wound up getting custody of me. My mom has always had horses, and me by extension, and she saw this as an opportunity to try running our own stable, since that was something my dad wasn't very interested in. The location she found a nice ranch in was about 10 kilometers from the nearest civilization, besides our sparse neighbors, and even more from any actual towns and stuff. I've never been a very outdoorsy person, so while I was excited about the new location and the prospect of being around my favorite animals so much, I was never too into the fact that we were in the middle of forests and somewhat excluded, especially since I was in my early teens during the time we lived there, and thus was dependent on getting a ride if I wanted to go out to the city. For further information, I lived in southern Finland, where there really isn't anything to fear in the forest, per se, but I've always been imaginative enough to make up for it. Now getting into what I was constantly paranoid about over the 5-ish years I lived there, which was being alone outside. I did not mind being around the horses or riding them in the forest, but every time I had to walk around on my own, I often felt very unsettled. Now, I always jotted this up to just my weak mentality, and surely most of it really was. It was fine during the daytime, but I would run from place to place in the dark with my heartbeat in my throat. It wasn't a concrete fear of anything specific like the dark, but just a sensation of primal fear. The worst part was waiting for the school bus in the morning because of how dark it is out here for most of the year. So I would have to stand by myself at the edge of our property on winter mornings and just pray that nothing was out there. It didn't help that the house wasn't even a safe place for me. It was large, and for most of the time it was just me and my mom, but she was out a lot going to work and tending to the animals, and I spent a lot of time alone in the house. There were parts of the house I avoided going to, and there was a generally strange vibe about the place. I don't know about the history of the house, but I do believe the previous owners abused their dogs. There were teeth and claw marks on most doorways, dog height. And allegedly, they'd been leaving the animals confided into singular rooms when they went off on business. Otherwise, the house was big in a long way, being only one story with one room having like a lofty space, and thus it had this long hallway running through the building. And I swear to God, going to the bathroom at night raised goosebumps every time, since I had to walk through it to get to the bathroom. Of course, this could all be attributed to me just being a scaredy cat. However, I also started feeling like I was being constantly watched by something, and I wound up changing my room since my old room used to have windows on ground level, and the new one had a window so far up that anything that wasn't taller than a human couldn't reach. There was a point of time where I got a bit braver and would take some walks around the nearby roads to prove myself there wasn't anything there. But then, I wound up almost getting ran over by a deer who was admittedly about as surprised as I was, and then having another incident where I literally ran all the way home because my instincts were simply telling me to. I don't have a grandiose story like everything was silent, like people often do, but my senses just screamed at me to run and not look back. And I'm not the type to deny that sort of instinct. The part where the story becomes more than just my paranoia comes right after I moved away at 16, which, while I liked living around horses, was a weight off my chest as I could actually walk around my home without constant fear of the unknown. When my mom began telling me some of the things she hadn't told me when I still lived with her because she knew I'd freak out, she told me, and get this, that there had been wolves sighted around our area in the past few months. Which doesn't justify all of my paranoia, but damn does it justify the most recent. And that there'd been some confirmed kills of deer by the wolves, literally right around our house. The closest being a deer literally across the road on the field by our house. I hadn't seen it since I had been away, but I had actually seen other carcasses in the area, and had noted them as a bit weird. That wasn't the worst part, though. The story that really made me happy I'd moved away comes from my mom, very casually mentioning to me that one morning she'd gone out to feed the horses as usual, 4 to 5 a.m., before having to head to work. But as soon as she'd stepped out of the house, she'd noticed something was off. We had motion sensor lights on the corner of the stable, so you had to walk a good few meters into the pitch darkness on the mornings to get them to activate. My mom had been walking out with our cats, and while they usually go happily ahead, that morning they'd seemed very reluctant to go past the porch light. My mom is fearless, though, and she'd just marched into the darkness. When the stable light had gone off, she'd seen a wolf lurking by the stable corner in the dark. It ran off when the light came on, but Mom had seen it for a moment. It had probably been just curious, checking out if there was any easy food around the area. Wolves aren't stupid enough to try and eat the horses. And she wasn't even totally sure if it was actually a wolf or something else. This news made me rather unhappy, though, but I hope that the wolves had only come around the area after I got my license for a moped and stopped taking the school bus. All of this to say, I lived for a good few years in a house and area that freaked me out, and I've not shared all of the spooky stories I have in this already unnecessarily long post. But if anyone has questions or similar stories, I would love to read them in the replies. I'm convinced that the house had like bad vibes because of the past owners, and the forest had bad vibes because of the predators. But the truth might honestly just be that I'm the kind of person to be easily spooked by the slightest of scary things. This story happened years ago, but if you know me personally, I've told you this story at least once in our friendship/relationship, which means you likely know my little brother as well. He too knows this story I'm about to share with you, as he experienced it with me. He'd tell you the exact same story if you asked him. I'm sure he remembers it the way I do, and it's a core memory we can't exactly get rid of. At this time, we lived in a small 2 to 3 bedroom house. It was an upstairs-downstairs home and consisted of me, my mom, my little brother, and my sister. Now, my sister and I shared a bedroom, and my little brother had his own. But my mom had her bedroom downstairs, so she didn't sleep on the same floor as us. This is important as we didn't get to sleep in her room when scared at night. Around this time, I remember being in my late elementary ages, 7 to 8 years old, and my siblings were a year or two younger than me, 6 to 7 years old. So you can imagine we'd get easily frightened by the dark and our imagination around bedtime. It's expected to have these irrational fears at this age, but it also didn't help that our house was a little off at night. My mom would joke that it were her ghost boyfriend, Jerry. But I think deep down she'd say it because she were also scared, and she didn't want to give us further reason to be scared. Our house was especially weird at night. Things would make noise on their own accord, such as heavy footsteps that belonged to no one who was creeping around the house at night, making the floorboards creak. Even stomping in certain rooms of the house on some nights, demanding to be acknowledged. Voices echoed in the halls that were also not ours. They were very clear, but also vague, silent cries, and more simply weeps or calls to someone, anyone listening to them. Things would disappear and reaper in the home. It was all weird, and I swear, whatever else lived there had a thing for tormenting me and my siblings. I never really acknowledged it when we lived there, but when I revisit these memories, I get unsettled as it definitely wasn't normal. Although this night it seemed it was a regular night for me at bedtime. I had been laying in my brother's room with him and my sister. As one had mentioned, they were feeling uneasy, so me and my sister decided to sleep over in my brother's room. This just helped us to get bed easier. It especially helped that his bedroom window invited the light from the street into his room, making it slightly easier to see in the dark, rather than me and my sister's room, which would be darker at this time. It didn't help that we also had a large closet in there too. I laid the furthest and closest to the edge of the bed, waking from the bed, rocking a little when I slept. My brother's bed was at a loft bunk. It was high enough, but also had enough space under that you could sit up under it. The only thing is that underneath it laid piles of dirty clothes, so there were no space to crawl or move under there freely. My eyes wandered around the room. With me being half asleep, I followed the lights reflecting on the wall into the hallway of my brother's doorway. That's when I saw it. The figure, the shadowy figure, the silhouetted mimic of my mom. As you would expect, younger me's breath stiffened and my eyes widened. My attention heightened by this potential threat while I had a mini heart attack in the loud silence. Almost instinctively, I shook my brother. He were closest to me, and I didn't want to take my eyes off of whatever it was I was looking at, so I could tell if I were seeing this for real. I shook and shook and shook, refusing to let him fall back to sleep after the first few shakes. When I heard him wake, I felt immediate relief. Something about him being awake told me I wasn't dreaming now and no longer alone to experience this. A reason to be brave. I cleared my throat and managed to ask him when he sat up, "Do you see that at all?" I pointed out to him and described it as he tried to find what I was looking at. It were so dark it were hard to tell if I were just imagining it or if it were real. The best way to describe it is that it were a shadowy figure, a literal silhouette. It had no face, no clothes, but a shadowy aura that made it hard to see its skin or body clearly. Only thing that seemed real visible were its hair, in which copied our mother's. It were so curly, the same length and practically laid in the same style my mom's hair would lay in. It continued to stare at us silently, still, uncanny, and feeding on our fears. It were extremely unnerving the way it sat just in the hall, hiding right before the doorway, peeking into the room at us. It blended into the dark. Only way for us to tell it was really there were by the strands of its hair that stayed visibly clear to see. It listened to our irrational conversation and weak attempts to scare it off, staying still and silent. My brother, now seeing it, had gotten the same idea I had and began calling out to it, believing it were our mother. "Mommy, we see you. We know that's you, Mommy. Now that I think of it, it really frightens me that we even thought it were our mom to begin with." That's how similar it was to her, and with so little features to work with, we were convinced out of fear. The fact that it knew it looked like her too, and mimicked her, is what scares me most. My reasoning to believing this was my mom was maybe she wanted us to go to bed, so she scared us to do so, but it also didn't dawn on me that I had woken up to that originally. In the process of me and my brother trying to convince ourselves it were her, we laid down to show her we were going to bed, in hopes she'd walk away, move, or say something to prove it were her. Especially if we're assuming she were doing that one distinct mom glare that moms do to get their kids to behave. Looking away for a slight second, the figure finally moved. It were abrupt and quick. It ran at us and hid right underneath the bed. Me and my brother looked at each other, fully convinced this were our mom now, believing she were playing an odd game with us. We peeked under the bed after sitting up from the jump start and didn't see anything but the laundry left there before. It looked untouched and also still. We didn't see our mom, but the cloth piles instead. This made my heart sink immediately, as my mind went to whatever it was is now gone, but it's also right under us. I know my brother was scared too, as he began hiding under his blanket and scooting away from the edge of the bed. I did the same, ensuring that my siblings were safe, as my sister slept through all of this beside us. To this day, I have no idea what I experienced, but this ghost or entity has taken up some space in my brain since. I don't know how we slept after that, but we did. It was so scary, we never spoke of it till a few years later, and when we brought it up to our mom after moving out of the house, she had a nervous laugh about it, as she never heard of this happening, but also confirmed she'd never done something like that to us. It was a weird home after all, and I have a few more stories of weird encounters that happened there, but they were all slightly less traumatizing. Let me know if something similar happened to you at all, or if we know what to call this phenomenon. That's it for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe.